But race is the idea that people can be sorted into exclusive groups that are marked by physical characteristics, right? And if we were going to list physical characteristics, you could know the ones we were going to list, right? And this image is showing you some of the most popular in America, especially it's been skin color, hair type, facial features, and other physical differences that are a result of ancestry and genetics. That's the idea of race. Now, you should be aware, and you are aware, but just to be very clear, sometimes those physical differences are viewed as unalterable. And furthermore, racial ideology often assumed the physical differences of the races corresponded to biological characteristics, such as intelligence or athleticism or inventiveness or sexuality, etc. So the idea is that they correspond to things in the racial groups. And the idea is usually there's 4 or 5 or 6 big groups that are believed to be quote unquote races. And so, and you still deal with some of these false but persistent racial theories, right? Like Black people are more athletic, or Asian people are better at science, or so-and-so is better at this, or this group is better at that. Those are stereotypes that are false, but still very powerful in the public imagination. And so that's a definition of race. It's a construct, we created it. And what I've got here on the screen is sort of the big ideas I'm talking about. And so I want to make sure you understand what a racialized society is. Actually coming up on this next screen. And then we'll move on to diving into the history. But just see, I'm going to use the term race, and so now you kind of know what I mean by that, what scholars mean by that. But I also want you to be aware of what a racialized society is. So the idea of race has drastically shaped many aspects of our American society. So don't get me wrong here. When I say race isn't biologically real, it's a construct. There's nothing in like DNA or something where you find something in the DNA that corresponds to any racial group that we've created. That just doesn't exist in the science. That is not to say, though, that our construction of race in those categories haven't played powerfully in society. They have. And so our society is a racialized society, and a racialized society is one in which race drastically shapes many aspects. So we live we live in a highly racialized society. I'm going to use a definition. I don't have it up here on the screen, but I'll say it slowly in case you want to grab it. I'm using the definition from Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And this is their definition of a racialized society. And you can just mark down the characteristics if you want. They say a racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And they go on to talk about, in a racialized society, different racial groups have different opportunities and possibilities for all sorts of things. You know what they are, right? Freedom is the obvious one. Wealth, property, political power, social influence, psychological well-being. There's all kinds of ways that race influences different experiences. So I'll give you just one of hundreds of examples from US history that we'll look at today. One of the ways that we racialized our society: European colonists defined a quote unquote white race as naturally free, as inherently free, and they defined a quote unquote black race as naturally slavish. Right. So they said, oh, this is a race and we're naturally free. And this is a race and they're naturally slavish. And white people in power then made laws. White people in power then, self-determined white people made laws that created and perpetuated that racial reality. So they constructed the idea that white people are naturally free and inventive, black people are naturally slavish and sluggish, and then they passed laws that said that and determined this group of people will be enslaved and can be, and this people will rule over them. And that racializes our society. So that's just some basic definitions. We'll continue doing that. I'll continue using those terms throughout. If you have questions, I can cover those. And if there's anything urgent that I need to clarify, please just shout out, and I can do that. I'm not against at all being interrupted, so please interrupt me. but I've got my notes on one screen and on my PowerPoint on the other, and I've got some faces over here on the other, so I might not see a chat box. So if you need to vocally interrupt me, do it. So we know now today that race is a social construct, right? This is a consensus among scholars in all different fields, but most of American history, people believed in the idea of the biological races. So the question then is, how did we create the idea of race? And so what my answer is this second section, how we constructed race. And so I'm going to argue here that the idea of races in our modern sense was created by European colonizers beginning in the 1500s. Okay, and so beginning in the 1500s, you have a colonial moment from Europeans. And I find 5 major ways that we created the construct of race. And the first one is colonization. And you all know the story of colonization. I've had this map up here, hopefully that you could see, but the way that colonization contributes to race is as Europeans encountered people all over the world for the first time in some of these places, all along the coast of West Africa, and then down over into Africa and into the Indian Ocean, but then all along the islands, and they encountered these island groups, and then in the Americas, the Native Americans. As they encountered these new types of people, they almost immediately described the new people that they encountered as inferior to themselves in all ways. And evidence that these Europeans found to suggest the inferiority of all these people that they encountered included things like their lack of technology, right? Especially military and maritime technology. Their clothing, which was often much less than their own, and much less difficult, for instance, to make. Their susceptibility to disease and death. As Europeans who have been Afro-Eurasia developed all kinds of ways to resist disease, and that the Native Americans simply did not have. And so in the perception of the Europeans, like, oh, these inferior people, they can't stand basic stuff like we can. And then also their primitive religions. So all of these things come together and they point to them and say, they're inferior to us. Do you see? A second major way that race was constructed, and this is probably the most significant institution anyway for constructing the idea of race, was the institution of slavery. So as European colonizers killed most of the Native Americans through all sorts of ways that they encountered, right? I mean, we're talking war, slavery, and disease. These basically wipe out, in many areas in the Americas, when the Europeans show up, 80%, 90%, 70% of the communities are wiped out. And it's not just disease, it's also war and slavery. Europeans needed laborers to exploit the resources in these new colonies. They needed more labor. And so for all kinds of reasons, which, I could do a whole lecture on right now, but we're not going to go into that. They developed the Atlantic slave trade, which relied on enslaved Africans, forcing Africans from especially West and Central Africa over into the Americas. And so Europeans forced more than 12 million Africans. That's the current number that scholars have. About 12.5 million is the estimate. Enforced 12 million Africans, and you can see the major areas from which Africans were stolen and forced across the Middle Passage into bondage against their wills, right? And on top of that, scholars estimate that Europeans enslaved somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans. So 2.5 to 5 million Native Americans. And so Europeans created laws and policies of discrimination that attempted to ensure Africans and Native Americans remained enslaved and separate from Europeans. So in the wake of slavery's brutality, Europeans developed ideas about race that helped them justify the system of slavery. I hope that all makes sense. You have, and this is important, and I'm noting a conversation that scholars have, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you have racism that justifies the enslavement of those racialized as inferior, and therefore you get this Atlantic slave trade? Or do you have the Atlantic slave trade and then like, oh, dang, and you develop racialized ideas about the inferiority of Native Americans and and Africans in order to justify this sort of brutal system. And most scholars are going to go with that latter. You get slavery, and race is constructed to justify the system. Again, that makes a lot more sense if I go into why Africa at this particular time, which I can do at some other point if we want to. But just be aware, slavery is one of the major ways that we constructed this idea of race. Another major way that we constructed the idea of race was European intellectuals. You want to call them thinkers, Enlightenment, quote unquote, scientists. And this is important, right? European intellectuals, they were obsessed after the Enlightenment, 1600s on. The thinkers loved to categorize everything. They were obsessed with this. And one of the ways that they categorized people was into colors. That they believed corresponded to races, and that was also geographical. You all know the song, right? Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight, right? Like, no, people are not red, yellow, black, and white. We made that up. And the longer you look at it and look at the various thousands of tones of skin color and the DNA stuff that makes up so many of the differences of the human family. No, people aren't in four colors. That's just, that's not how we come. But by the 17th century, Europeans had started to call themselves white, and they came to believe the so-called races were marked not only by skin color, though that came to be the most obvious marker of the so-called races, right? Especially in America, but in North America, but also by biological traits and characteristics. And that's what you're seeing here, right? So by biological characteristics, that is, some are smart and some races are dumb, and some races work hard and other races are lazy. Some are Christian and others are heathen. Some are free and others are naturally slavish, and so on, right? You can see Carl Linnaeus is here. He's probably the most influential of the categorizations that came to dominate by the 18th century. Carl Linnaeus, he's often called the father of scientific racism. Though these things go all the way back to the 1500s, Europeans constructing these ideas. And you can see his categorization, right, of humanity into these four different races. He has actually a fifth sort of like mongrel group as well. And this is what he believed to be the biological differences between the racial groups. And these kind of categorizations, and these are coming from Christians, right? These kind of categorizations went back, like I said, all the way to the 1500s. And they've been thoroughly debunked, especially for the last 70 years, by scholars in all the fields. However, these are still in the minds of many Americans today. Like, I mean, I can tell, we can all start telling the stories, right? Some of this stuff, you hear it come out in sort of unconscious statements as people talk about encountering others in their society. And again, we can talk more about that at some point if we wanted to as well. But let me keep moving on the construct of race. The fourth of the five were laws, which is maybe surprising to you. You might have seen like colonization and slavery coming. Maybe you saw laws coming, maybe you didn't. But Europeans passed laws in the 17th century and the 18th century in their various colonies to ensure the creation of a racial hierarchy that was based on white supremacy. Now, white supremacy is the idea that Europeans who began to call themselves white in this era were biologically superior or supreme, right? That's the idea. And so the laws they passed not only legalized slavery, and that's what you probably know, but the laws also made slavery race-based. And they helped create the idea of races. They helped construct the idea of races. For example, laws either assumed or said that there were different races. They would say, like, literally, they would say, like, there's a European white race and an African black race, or, the native red race, for example. And then they would say things like, and those two races are not allowed to marry or to have sex, because if you do that, you'll get some kind of a mongrel. And so laws also made, besides, what they called anti-misogyny laws, anti-misogynation, which again, you still see some judges pushing. Even in the last 10 years, we've seen cases where literally workers for the state in some states got fired because they wouldn't marry people from different racial groups. Some of this stuff still lingers, right, in our society. These laws also made enslaved people property. So they developed these laws, developed the principle of chattel slavery, which is absolutely essential for understanding the dehumanization of especially Black people, but also others on the bottom of the racial hierarchy. So they made people property and took away nearly all of their basic human rights. And so what you end up getting is this cyclical kind of vicious cycle. You take away all the rights, you take away all possibilities for freedom, you take away all possibilities for success, you name people as unable to create, even though you've taken all away all the options for creation. And then everything that you believe is affirmed because you've taken away any possibility for any different vision. So by the time that the US was founded in the 1770s, white supremacy was firmly embedded in our laws and policies. The systems and the structures of society, the concrete of this nation is built on white supremacy. In other words, what I mean, lighter skinned people were considered biologically superior and by law had privileges that other races were either completely denied or rarely had. You know the privileges: freedom, property rights, jobs, land, education, wealth, and the influence that comes with those things, et cetera, et cetera. And these inequities, this is really important to name here. Once you put this into the concrete, these inequities shaped all of American history right up to the present. You don't just take this stuff away and give it back after hundreds and hundreds of years, and then magically all things are okay. And that's the problem post 1960s, which we'll talk about in future weeks. A lot of people assume that post 1960s all is well and this history doesn't matter anymore, but it does. And the final one, and the most troubling one for us here as people who call Christ our Lord and are in some ways related, right? These are our forebears. These are our sisters and brothers and cousins. European Christians used the Bible for religious justification of slavery and slavery's racial basis. And the most important passage was Genesis 9. And that's why I've got a picture here, and don't worry, I've edited it for you, because this picture actually comes from a Bible manuscript that of Genesis 9, and you all know the story probably of Genesis 9. I'll tell it in brief, but Genesis 9, the curse of Ham, or really it's the curse of Canaan, Ham's son. So in that passage in Genesis 9, Ham apparently, so Noah gets just wasted, it seems like Noah is out of it. He's had way too much wine and he's passed out. And Ham apparently acted appropriately when he encountered his naked, drunk father Noah. And because of this, the text is just not clear, but he does something wrong. And the other two brothers don't. They do it correctly. And so because of this, because Ham encountered him wrong, Ham's son Canaan, Noah curses Ham's son Canaan into perpetual servitude to his two brothers, to Ham's brothers. And so from that starting point, slave owners added a racial gloss. Now the racial gloss is not in the text, right? It's not there, but the slave owners added a racial gloss to suggest that the curse of Ham was black skin. Now, to be clear, this is not in the text. They made this up. But for them, now think about this, how powerful this was. This made Canaan the progenitor of the African quote unquote race. And suddenly with Genesis 9, these European Christians have a passage that not only justifies slavery, but it justifies the enslavement of Black Africans. And not only the enslavement of Black Africans as the progeny of Ham, but that Black slavery was God ordained. This is a God ordained institution that should dominate social relations between white and Black people. Many white Christians held this interpretation so deep in their bones that they don't even try to justify it. By the end of the 9th century, I'm still blown away every time as a historian I pick up a document. I'm like, oh sweet, they're going to talk about Genesis 9, and it's a white, for instance, Southerner here in Tennessee, who in every other way is totally devoted to the lordship of Christ. And his question isn't, is this Genesis 9 applicable to a curse on Black people? It's, will the curse be lifted? That's the question. The question isn't even, does it apply? And so it's so thoroughly embedded in so many ways. Now, don't hear me wrong. Black thinkers and a few white thinkers are coming after this hard already in the 18th century and the 19th century. All right. So nobody gets a pass here because you have writers, even on the national stage. What I'll say over and over again, you'll have Black Christians and other racial minority Christians who are reading these texts and developing a much more authentic Christian gospel that sees through this disgusting oppression. And so no one gets a pass. We have to take these people as people who are of their time, but they heard other voices as well. And often just disregarded them. So beyond Genesis 9, though, there's plenty of other things, and I don't want to talk about. I want to talk about the big ones. Europeans also found justification for slavery in the Bible, right? And we can talk about a lot of things. So the Old Testament sanctioned slavery as long as it wasn't oppressive, right? So you can look at Exodus, but as soon as you get the Exodus and God liberating his people and sending them to the promised land, then you get the law. And the law tells the Hebrews how to do slavery well, right? And so even that is like, well, as long as it's not oppressive, and they could point to that. You have the New Testament authors who never condemned slavery. In fact, the opposite is true in the household codes over and over and over. It's slaves, be good slaves, masters, be good masters. And I'll say more about those arguments later on. And I come after everybody in this particular era because they're begging the Bible to do things it doesn't claim that it will do. So we'll get there at some other time, but just be aware that they have some powerful arguments just using a literal interpretation of the Bible. But the question for most European Christians was not, is like slavery okay? Most of them were like, yeah, right. That's not a question until the 1770s and 1780s for that's not a question for everyone until then. The most pressing question was, can we baptize enslaved people? That was the European question, especially Protestant question. The Catholics were dealing with it as well, but the Protestant colonizers, especially in North America, this is the question: is it okay? And initially, Protestant slave owners said no. They're like, no, we're not baptizing these people. And there's a long history there. The best book on it right now is I've got on the slide here for you, Christian Slavery. And by the way, Catherine Gerbner, if you watch the Black Church documentary from Henry Louis Gates, she was on there, which was awesome because I recently read and reviewed this book. It's so good, but she helps us understand what's happening here. And so what happened is early Protestant planters had created a Christianity that was exclusive, and in their laws and in their language, when you dive into the sources of the 1600s, they had these categories that are Negro and Christian. And those are mutually exclusive categories or identities. And so they've developed these racial categories that are religious as well. You're Christian, i.e. European and white, or you're Negro, i.e. heathen and darker skinned. And so they developed what scholars often call the triads. Europeans are Christian, white, and free by nature. Africans are heathen, Negro, and slave by nature. That was the articulation that was sort of opposed baptizing. But Christian missionaries really start changing this, and including Anglican, right? The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel missionaries are really important in this story. And it's a sweet and sour story, right? Because they're like, they came through in the late 1600s and early 1700s making the argument that you should baptize enslaved people. And they had two major reasons for this. And this is on the baptize enslaved people. They said, the reason that we should baptize your slaves, and you planters should not be worried about us baptizing enslaved people, we can make sure that the laws say nothing about baptism having to do with physical freedom. That was the concern. Baptism is only about spiritual freedom. You can be baptized and not get physical freedom. And the missionaries encouraged colonial legislatures to pass those laws, and they did. We get those laws in the middle of the 1600s, and they continue coming in the late 1600s and the early 1700s. Literally, the missionaries are encouraging a shift in the legal language to allow for enslaved people to be baptized, but to retain their slave status. The second thing that the missionaries did to encourage planters to baptize their enslaved people was that they argued that enslaved people would be better workers and better people if they were Christianized. And so once planters could get that on the books, then we're pretty good. You know, let me read you one of the baptismal confessions from the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel missionary, one of the missionaries in the 1720s. Here's the vow you take if you're going to be an enslaved person and baptized. You declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that you do not ask for holy baptism out of any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience you owe to your master while you live, but merely for the good of your soul and to partake of the grace and blessings promised to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ. Right? That is the confession that many were given in the 1720s, 1730s. I'm not going to go into whiteness because I want to make sure I cover this other stuff, but just be aware that what happens in the shift in language is instead of Christian and heathen and Negro as separate categories, Christian becomes a category that anyone can be, as these Christian missionaries convince many people that enslaved people should be baptized. And what changes in the laws and the legal language, instead of Christian, you get white. And so the big takeaway here is that the term white begins to replace Christian as an indicator of freedom and mastery in the laws. And so whiteness, even further down in the concrete and in the consciousness of the nation and of the Christian church, whiteness becomes, at least among white folks, this idea that we are free naturally and we are masters naturally, and black and red people are heathen and slave naturally. And so here's the deal. Missionary logic and tactics did lead to the Christianization of enslaved people, but those developments also contribute to the creation of this concept of whiteness as a racial category, and especially to the category of the ideology of white supremacy. And that's the story. That's one of the stories that Catherine Gerbner tells in her book. I know that's complex and stuff, but just be aware there's a lot of stuff going on here. All right, so let's move on and jump in then just quickly. You all know this story probably better than some of that other story, but now you know how we created the construct of race, right? These 5 ways we created the construct of race, and Christians were part of that at every step of the way, sometimes explicitly using the religion. All the while, especially enslaved Christianized people were constantly still writing letters in the 1700s to people, including it to Anglican bishops, urging and begging, please, this is ludicrous. We're being treated badly. We're Christians. We should be treated better. Even not necessarily arguing for full physical freedom, but just better treatment because they're Christians. So in the United States, what happens then, the real opposition to slavery comes really in the 1770s and 1780s with this new idea. It's a new political idea. We call it classical liberalism in history and political philosophy. But the basic idea is that all people have inalienable rights. I mean, think about this, you all. Like, the United States was built on this new political idea that was laid down in the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that all people have inalienable rights to freedom. How on earth, this is the question, right? How on earth do you fight for the idea that people have inalienable rights to freedom and even go up again in a war against one of the most powerful nations in the world, and at the same time support an institution that systematically took away freedom from more than 15 million people and created laws to make it perpetual? It's hereditary, perpetual enslavement, the exact opposite, as far opposite as you can get. And you know the answers, right? If we were going to spend some time here, I would try to get you to think about it. But either you say that slaves aren't humans, right, and they don't have souls, and most people aren't going with that right now. There are some advocates for that. Most white people in power aren't going for that. And by the way, if you're wondering who are making all these ideas, you can look at this picture and see who has a seat at the table, right? These are older white men, right? I mean, that's who has a seat at the table. There's a few young ones here and there, but primarily these are elite, land-owning, older white men. Either enslaved people, and it's here especially they're thinking about Africans and African Americans, don't have souls, or and this is the one that really allows the deepest contradiction of American society at its beginning, that allows these two ideals to exist together in the concrete of the nation. Slaves are members of an inferior race. Racism is the way that you get around this. These people are an inferior race and they need paternalistic oversight to become the best possible people they can be. And if they don't have oversight of, quote unquote, white people, the Europeans, then they'll just revert to barbarism that they lived in back in Africa. And thus, not only can we have Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution that think all people have inalienable rights, we can also view slavery as a positive good. These people here can, right? The people at the table, because of racism. You have to have racism as the starting point. And that is racism both in the sense of Africans need paternalistic oversight and white people are superior. It's both white supremacy and anti-Black racism. It requires both of those. But here's the deal. I'm rolling here. It's 9:40. I don't want to get deep into this, but I could read you the Declaration of Independence. In the first draft, Thomas Jefferson's biggest critique of King George III is his development of slavery. It's the longest one, but the southern colonies would not sign on to it, and so it got deleted. But he calls King George III a tyrant above all other reasons because he developed slavery and threw it on America. Now, at the same time that Thomas Jefferson wrote that, he had 100 to 200 slaves. So these are strange times with deep contradictions as people wrestle. And here's the to explain what's happening. People are wrestling with a new political idea that becomes the norm in the world, which is that people have inalienable rights. Yet they're at the exact same time coming to the awareness. Many of the founding fathers and many of the leaders in the Christian church are coming to the awareness that they had developed a deeply racist society. They're coming to the awareness of this. They're not totally aware, but they are coming to an awareness of it. And then you get the U.S. Constitution, and you all know that the U.S. Constitution makes slavery the law of the land, and it does this in a few ways. One is the Fugitive Slave Clause, right? And that's Article 4, Section 2. The Fugitive Slave Clause is a federal overreach for the states. So you can be a state and you can be a free state and you can get rid of slavery. But if an enslaved person escapes and goes to a free state, you, in your free state, by law in the U.S. Constitution, are required to help return that fugitive slave. So the entire nation is complicit. And that only gets strengthened by later acts in 1793 and then in 1850, new fugitive slave legislation that requires all of Americans to participate in the return of enslaved people. The other one, of course, as the 3/5 or enumeration clause, right? And this says that every enslaved person or non-free person counts as 3/5 of a person. That's not the most vicious part, though, of this clause. The most vicious part is it gave slave-owning colonies even more power because it actually counted enslaved people for 3/5 to get more representatives in Congress, so it gave them even more power to legislate against the people that were giving them the power. It's really, really sinister. And then finally, what is often called the corrupt deal in the Constitution. Several Southern states demanded that the international slave trade not be condemned. And so Article 1, Section 9, Congress limited expressly the U.S. government from prohibiting the importation of slaves before 1808. So they set a 20-year moratorium on it. Now, to Congress's credit, January 1, 1808, they outlaw the international slave trade, not the state slave trade, in the nation, the domestic slave trade, but they do. But still, that's pretty sinister. They say for 20 years, we ain't even talking about it. The international slave trade will continue. So a snapshot quickly at 1800, right? So we're at the beginning of the U.S. Constitution. You've seen how white supremacy is embedded in the laws. You've seen how Christianity has sort of helped construct this idea of racism. A snapshot in 1800, there were about 750,000, 800,000 enslaved people. They make up about 18% of the population in the 1790 census, right? So about 1/5-ish of the American population is enslaved. Some of these states have nearly half of the population are enslaved, like South Carolina. And a scholarly study, by the way, recently, just in case you've been like lured in by one of the narratives that Southerners especially articulated in the 19th century, which was slavery's pretty good and people are fine and most people aren't like hating it. A recent analysis of 600,000 sales in America, interstate sales of enslaved people, showed that 25% of every sale destroyed a first marriage, so separated a husband and wife, and 50% of the sales, one out of every two, broke up a nuclear family. And these are often kids below 13. So the numbers are starting to come in and the truth is becoming clear. And Christians knew about this. The stuff I'll tell you about in just a minute in abolitionism makes it pretty clear. Okay, so because of all these things, because of slavery, because of some of the viciousness, because of the awareness of what's going on, both black and white, these people who've been believed to be black and believed to be white in racial categories launch an abolitionist movement. Now you can see here I've just laid over the abolitionist movement legally in the United States. You get some states that abolish slavery even before the Constitution is ratified. Then you have other states passing laws for gradual emancipation. And then you have some states allowing individual cases of emancipation in some scenarios. And a lot of that gets taken away. Like you gotta move north if you're going to emancipate slaves eventually. But nonetheless, the abolition movement has some steam. I mean, let's look at just some of these people here. And these are just some of the leading Christians in America in the 1770s. There's an evangelical moment where it looks like the evangelical and the Protestant groups will be the moral conscience of the moral conscience of the nation. John Wesley condemned slavery in 1774 in a pamphlet that he takes the gloves off. I mean, it's not even beating around the bush. He says slavery can't be reconciled with justice, mercy, or Christianity. And he literally says, he sounds like Abe Lincoln in the second inaugural, that God would atone for the blood of the slaves with the blood of traders and owners. I mean, that's like, he's literally saying, you take that blood, God's going to take you. The Baltimore Methodist Conference declared slavery contrary to the laws of God and man and nature and hurtful to society, and encouraged all Methodists to free their slaves. That's 1780. 1784, the Methodist Conference voted to expel people who held slaves. Now, of course, I'm not giving you all the pushback that 1785, they went back on it, right? Because slaveholders like, no, 1789, the Virginia Methodist James O'Kelly said slave owners were devils incarnate. He literally says, he's saying to his Christian people even, he's writing in Virginia, he said Satan was the creator of slavery. These are leaders. These are leaders in America. In 1800, the entire General Conference of the Methodists said that Negro slavery was a national evil because it was repugnant to the unalienable rights. So they used the political philosophy, but they also are looking at it being anti-Christian. They explicitly say this in 1800. Barton Stone, who is a leader of the Christian churches, presented a resolution that said we ought to kick out everybody out of the Presbyterian church if they own slaves, because it's moral evil. He in 1801 will say that the revival is he's a part of these big revivals, and he says they're breaking the bonds of slavery. The revival is God's act in the world to break down this wickedness of slavery. And this is a tragic story, though, because almost every single one of these groups in literally 10 years time will go back on this. They're going to go back on this. And instead of arguing that slavery is satanic and for immediate emancipation, even people like Francis Asbury, who are leading this movement, will move to a vision of amelioration. Let's ameliorate the slave. Let's work to convert enslaved people instead of work to overturn the system. They just get they eventually get comfortable with the system, and they move away from their from 1800 to 1820. I view it as one of the most tragic 2 decades in Protestant American Christianity, because you see this stuff. It's not up to question. The leaders of the evangelical groups, especially the Methodists, I don't have the Baptists up here, Baptist Congregationalists, there's some Anglicans getting involved in this too, explicitly say this is satanic and evil. And in 10 years time, they're saying, well, They've won a whole lot of slave owners, Methodists and Baptists especially. They're on the margins in the 1780s, and from the margins, they're able to be very prophetic and condemn the powers. But in 1820, they have become the powerful. They have grown exponentially. Many slaveholders have come into their ranks, and they lose their ability to speak truth to power. They've literally just lost their prophetic edge because they've just cozied up, and they've got so many people. They got so many people who are involved. That is not to say that many white and black Christians continued to condemn slavery. They just became less and less powerful. They'll rise up in the 1830s. Don't get me wrong, but I'm telling the story about 1800s and 1810s because we got to sit in this miserable tragedy where Christians were the conscience, and because of economics and because of growth and because of power dynamics and because of white supremacy, it continues. They embrace slavery. One of the big things that happens is colonization. So a new idea happens with slavery in the U.S. that captivates many of those who had condemned slavery in 1780. And in 1816, so in the 1810s, a Presbyterian minister started the American Colonization Society, and it captivated the United States. I mean, you see Henry Clay is signing this as a president. You get presidents involved in this. You get major Protestant leaders who buy into colonization. And the basic idea of colonization is built on even those who wanted to end slavery. Those white folks who are so influenced by racism really still didn't believe that black people could assimilate into white culture. They didn't think that white and black people could live together. This story happens again in 1960s and 1970s, and they're using similar arguments. But here they just didn't think. And so what the American Colonization Society is an attempt to just remove black people, remove Africans from America and colonize them in Africa. That's the idea here. That's what the Colonization Society is after. And the founder, a Presbyterian minister, says this. He says, we have three things that happen with the Colonization Society. First, three benefits. It's a threefold benefit. We are cleared of black people, so we remove what they see as the problem, Africans that were brought here. And so they view this as like, oh, we'll get rid of the racial problem by just taking Africans and putting them in Africa, even though most at that point, are not from Africa, they're from America. And we also give Africa a population that's partly civilized and Christianized, so maybe we'll win a few, right? And then it's for the benefit of the black people who themselves will be in a better condition. So even people in America, the Colonization Society, know that America is not good. It's not a hospitable space for freed black people. So the Colonization Society captivates, and many of those folks who had argued for emancipation didn't go to this because, again, they're still deep in their bones fairly racist and don't think that a racially inferior group can assimilate into a society driven by white folks. So I have a few minutes left that I want to do this last section. I'm going to do it pretty quickly because I know we're going to stop here around 9:58 for a closing prayer, and then we'll have some discussion time. So African-American Christianity, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of what happens. It's insane, though, despite all of the stuff I just said. African Americans come into Christianity and adopt Protestant Christianity and Catholic Christianity. The story here in North America is mostly at this time Protestant Christianity in the 1740s, but especially in around 1800. Can you imagine why? The evangelicals are literally saying God despises slavery. And they have this message of new birth conversion that says you can be when you're born again and you experience conversion, everyone's on an equal spiritual playing field before the Almighty God. It is a powerful and captivating message. And then scholars also, and I'm going to spare you a lot of the scholarly details, right? But scholars then also do a lot of comparisons about West African traditional religions and the similarities between those sort of characteristics of the diverse traditional religions and the characteristics of evangelicalism in 1800. And there are a lot of similarities, right? And so what you get is this fusion of West African traditional religions coming in and accepting evangelical Christianity and deeply shaping evangelical Christianity. And you get this sort of white-black synthesis throughout the 19th century where free and enslaved African and African Americans coming into evangelical Christianity put their stamp on it and really influence it. But they adopt evangelical Christianity. What you'll see here, though, from this Methodist camp meeting from 1809. You'll see down here, if you can see this, it says Negro tents, right? And so from the very beginning, you have segregation, right? So you have white, you have the white tents back here, but then you have the Negro tents here. And oftentimes these revivals, you'll have several areas of worship, but there's going to be a segregated space. So despite these ideas of new birth being spiritual equivalent and the idea of inalienable rights and all people being equal, just the arrangement of space built up and substantiated these racist ideas, right? They continue to say, well, we can't be together because we're different on the racial hierarchy. Christianity can be for everyone, but we're different. And so evangelical brings folks in at the same time. It's full of deep contradictions, and especially as the American Colonization Society shifts, Black Christians who have jumped into evangelical Christianity, and again, it's a pour from the 1800s on as African Americans adopt especially Methodist and Baptist Episcopalian versions of Christianity and make it their own. What you end up getting is independent Black Christian churches, independent African Christian churches, and the reason is almost every time because of white racism in the churches. And so you all can appreciate the very first denomination, the very first independent Black denomination starts in 1794 under the leadership of Richard Allen, who I have pictured here. And it's the AME Church, right? The African Methodist Episcopal Church. And that's because Richard Allen and some of his friends, Absalom Jones, and they had been going to a Methodist church in St. George's in Philadelphia, and they were exposed to just really mean-spirited, racist sort of attack during worship when they were forcibly tried to move during prayer. They wouldn't even let them stay there during prayer. And I would read you the story if I had more time. But Richard Allen gives us this story in his autobiography, and he's like, they literally tried to force us during prayer. And we said, all right, after prayer was done, we walked out, and they were never bothered by us again. And African Americans were just forced to build their own independent churches where they could flourish. And so what happens is a flourishing, the AME Church is officially founded in 1816. Then you get AME Zion, but you have others, Presbyterians, Baptists, other Episcopalians building their own churches already in the early 19th century. And then you get an explosion after the Civil War, and it's legally possible for others. And I'll talk about that next week more. And so be aware, independent churches are happening. You also have the enslaved experience in evangelical churches, which is very different. So you have several options, right? For the enslaved experience, you have a few options. One of them I've got shown here, right? You can have some enslaved Black Christians were allowed to meet together, but you had to have a white supervision, right? This especially happens after the 1820s slave revolts and the 1830s Nat Turner slave revolt. You're almost always going to have supervision when Black Christians are getting together in the enslaved areas. You also have a lot of the times just Black people are forced to go to the white church where they hear these, these sermons about the gospel of slavery, obey your masters, don't steal, don't lie. But where the real action happens is in the hush harbors, the brush harbors, which I've pictured here. These are meetings out of view of the whites. And from all of the evidence we have from the Black slave narratives and Black autobiographies in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, these took place all the time. And this is where you get these deep spiritual traditions of song and theology that I would argue are a deep and authentic vision of the Christian gospel. In the midst of some nasty, non-Christian Christians. And these traditions will permeate American Christianity. They'll become the bedrock of the civil rights movement of America up to this day. But they take place out of the gaze of the powerful, out of the gaze of the oppressor. And there's just all kinds of fun stuff that we could talk about that develops here. And resistance is really important. These deep traditions of resistance and resilience bubble up and really become so important to the Christian tradition in America. And they expose racism. They come against racism. They come against the racist vision of the Christian church, and they demand better. And it's just so exciting that this continues to happen, right? Even in the midst of this just sheer wickedness and so many people being blind, there were plenty that were tapped in, that were tapped into the authentic gospel of Jesus Christ, even though not everyone could hear them. All right, so that's my talk for today. I think I've barely just cut myself off in enough time. We'll jump into the Civil War stuff, and then right after the Civil War stuff next week. But now you know how race was created, how Christianity contributed to it, and how all of that worked out in U.S. Christianity in the years before the Civil War.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorman, for your very engaging and informative lecture. And I'm sure that we are all just waiting to hear your next remarks. And you've given us a lot to think about. My family comes from the AME tradition, and then I heard about Richard Allen when I was very, very young. So let us now have our closing prayer.
In the stillness of our hearts, we thank you, God, for our many blessings and celebrate the joy we have in knowing our risen Lord, Jesus Christ. Today, we recognize the sins of our past and we ask for forgiveness. Give us grace with each other. For those among us who wrestle with our country's past, we ask for reconciliation. For our brothers and sisters who are hurting because of recent events in our country, we ask for comfort. For all who struggle with our country's future, we ask for peace and reassurance of your constant presence. Bless us, O God, and grant us patience, tolerance, and love, so we may walk together in your heavenly light and have true fellowship with one another. Amen.
Thank you so much, Ann O'Connor. I recognize that voice. I can't see you. And thank you, Allie Brown, for selecting this wonderful prayer. Those of you who want to stay and listen to Dr. Gorman, we'll talk maybe a little bit more. And there were some questions in the chat box. And those of you who are going to rush down North Shore to get to church, we'll see you back again this time next week. Thank you. That. I'm the last one that should be running the chat box because I don't know how to use the chat box.
Yeah,
But
well, I guess I should say I can come in here, and I'm happy to field any questions that anyone has now, or to talk about, or comments. I'm seeing some of the comments just now. I was not paying attention then, and giggling at a couple because that's great. Which is, yeah, but I'm happy to talk to. So, is there a culture or country that is not racialized? Yeah, right. I mean, that's a really that is an interesting question from Mary, and my knee-jerk response is always going to be like, well, is there a country that wasn't colonized? Because it seems like colonization, it typically is in our modern history is when that has happened. And so yeah, I think folks who have been left alone to develop their own stuff, they're just going to have their own cultural problems. But that's my knee-jerk response to that one. I don't know if other people have thoughts, but so Donna's got a good question here. How or from whom did the slave traders obtain people to enslave, especially from Africa? And so that story is, I mean, the Portuguese and the Spanish developed ship technology just a coincidence of time in the 1400s, and but it was at the same time that the Turkish Muslims had taken Constantinople. If you've got a map in your head, and so it became very difficult for European Christians to get over to the Indian Ocean trading market. because Muslims now ran all of the Middle East and even up into the Balkans, and they had been in conflict with Christians for hundreds of years now. And so with new ship technology, it's like, well, maybe we know we can sail around Africa. We think we can anyway, the bottom, to get into the Indian Ocean slave trade because they wanted stuff over there. This is the reason that Columbus accidentally, quote unquote, discovered the Americas. And this is why Europeans came onto even being aware that there were Africans that they could barter. And so what happens is, at the time, a lot of people think that, there's a African identity, but there's not a Pan-African identity in the 1400s and 1500s. The Pan-African identity really comes post-colonialism, but post-slavery as well. That there's some late 1800s, early 1900s is when you start getting the earliest Pan-African identity. So what happens in Africa in the 1400s and 1500s is mostly, there are a few empires, but largely it's tribal stuff. And so tribal warfare is constant. And when you are in war as tribes, you take your enemies captive, and they're a threat. You know what I mean? They're a threat to your community, to the well-being of your community. So you have options. You can kill those prisoners of war, which often happens. But after the Europeans show up and start saying, oh, we need labor, well, Europeans have guns and they have concho shells, which Africans used as money, which Europeans are now getting over in the Indian Ocean. And they can trade these guns and these concho shells for prisoners of war. That's one way that Europeans get Africans. Another way is to go in and raid and steal, and that happens all the time. Though the further you get into the interior, the less likely Europeans are going to be successful at stealing Africans, because they die of malaria and die of other things, and they just get outmaneuvered and outwitted. But largely, many of the slavers get their ship full of human cargo, enslaved people, from deals done from tribal folks, to the point of we have some tribal leaders who write to England who are like, how dare you stop, in the 1830s, like, how dare you stop the slave trade? What are we going to do with our prisoners of war? And that is certainly not everyone. And that is not to suggest, don't hear what I'm not saying. This is all evil, and people knew it, which is why the international slave trade they could say, I want to abolish the international slave trade because it's wicked, because the Middle Passage, I mentioned 12 million come across, only 10 million make it. You have at least 10, maybe up to 15% die on the Middle Passage, either because of slave revolts, because Africans did not go willingly or passively, or because of the disease and the horrid conditions, which were awful. And so Christians in America, for instance, could say, we despise that. Let's get rid of it in 1808, yet continue to say we're good with our slave trade over here, the domestic slave trade. And slaves increase from 1 million to 4 million in America with zero international slave trade, just by domestic, quote unquote, reproduction. I mean, the average birth rate of enslaved women was 9.2. And so it becomes a, quote unquote, farming of human beings to replenish. And so no less wicked, but in their minds, they're envisioning this. So I'm getting away from the original question, which was, where did these African people come from? And largely along that West Coast, either stealing or trading with tribes who were constantly at war and had a lot of prisoners of war. So it was a win-win for the tribal leaders, because you make money instead of just killing your enemies, and you're rid of them. I don't know if other people had any other questions, or I can move down through here. Yeah, Gigi says, when is slavery not oppressive? Hopefully I never said that, but if I did, it always is. Yeah, it's always awful and horrible. Other questions or comments?
Was the argument not to baptize slaves kind of like biting the hand that feeds you? In order to get into heaven, you have to be baptized. What are they going to do, these white supremacists, for slaves in heaven?
Oh yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and I bet you could dive into the sources from the time, and I bet there's got to be some of that. There continues to be some of that in American history. I mean, you see that pop up all the time. Like, I see that you have baptized them, and that person is now in our in our church, but they're not going to heaven, are they? Like, we literally have that kind of stuff on record in the 19th century from white supremacists. So, that's a great point. That is a great point. I can't point you to a place that says that. In Catholic Gerbner's book, which is the best book that dives into the sources and the reasonings for what she calls Christian slavery, which is what I was articulating there about the shift from using Christian and Negro to Christian, and you have white and Negro, so you get white supremacy and stuff. She's especially looking at those, and the major arguments that they're making early on is oftentimes about dehumanization. But yeah, I feel confident that we could go to the sources and find exactly what you're saying for sure in some of those. Shows the recolonization locations in Africa? Sure. Do we learn more about how that went for them? Let's see, I'll share this real quick. Can you say, let's see, I think that was Pauline. Can you say more about that question? Do we learn, and I'll show this, but you said, do we learn more about how that went? Are you saying how that went for the enslaved? I don't know if Pauline's still on here. Well, you're seeing this. I can speak to this for a moment. You can see that the large, and we could we could be a little bit more accurate exactly on some of this stuff, but this is a pretty good like simplistic version, because you do have some folks East Africa as well, but largely the large majority of enslaved people don't come directly to North America. Almost everyone is going to the Sugar Islands here in the Indies, where there's a constant replenishment. In some areas, average slave life is 7 years, but it was cheaper for the planters to just replace, oftentimes, with another enslaved person than to increase or better the working conditions. And then you have a lot of folks as well going to Brazil and into the Americas. I don't have all the stuff listed on this particular one, but there's a lot of stuff going. Sugar is the big cash crop, so they're making cash crop. But there's others as well. Mining is big. I mean, Spain and Portugal get rich with silver mining, and they use Native Americans for that a lot. But like I said, they just die quickly. So Africans are stuck in the mines a lot. But you only get about, you can see about 4% come directly to British America. Most of the others are often coming via, if they come to North America from other places. And so, like I said, though, you only have quote unquote. But by the time the revolutions happening around 1800, you have about, you don't quite have 1 million enslaved people in British North America. And so that's obviously partly because of reproduction as well, which is one of the reasons that those early laws said if you're a slave, then your children will inherit your slave status. That was a very early, folks in power early on saw that as a key opportunity. And then you can see the major places. The large majority of Africans were from African traditional religions, but there were quite a few Christians as well. Christianity had been very big in Congo and Angola, and there were a lot of Christians wrapped up in the slave trade. And you also have quite a few Muslims that are enslaved as well. So Christianity and Islam are the two religions of enslaved Africans, next in number to traditional African religions. I mean, this over here, you had there are these great, massive, like when we study World Civ, there are 2 or 3 African civilizations that just will blow your mind in the first 2 millennia. Of course, the slave traders always downplay that, and because they have to construct Africans as inferior and barbaric and everything, so that they either didn't know or just disregarded the empires that Africans had built that were way more sophisticated than anything the Americans had done at that point. So anyway, yeah, that's a little bit on that. That's helpful.
Comment on that.
Yeah.
That the Middle Kingdoms of Sangay and all those places, and a lot of the Africans that came to the United States came with some skills. They came with some skills about agriculture and how to transport, things like that. And often they would try to get those people, they would try to enslave them in Africa and then send them on. And you made another comment about family structure, 9.1 birth rate, and then how these families were broken apart. My very own mother, who was born in 1904, um, most of her adult life, she would be very morose and sad in the months of March and April, because that's when the family was broken up in Tennessee and sent off to various parts of Kentucky and Indiana, never to see each other again. And there was a lot of time spent in our family trying to find people. It's always been of interest. On my desk right now, I have a stack of photographs from the late 1800s on up through these times where someone found some family photos in California and sent them to me, because I'm the oldest one now left. And they're hoping that I can remember these people. But the whole business of breaking up families, um, we haven't accounted for that psychological damage, and it persists from those days forward.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, and yeah, that's absolutely right. It's a really good point. I'm seeing now in the chat, I don't want to go over time here, but I'm seeing now that I think the comment was about recolonization, and I missed that. Let me show that slide quickly. That I think we were looking at, maybe some folks were looking at Sierra Leone. Liberia is, that's the one that the American colonization purchased. And in terms of numbers, I don't know. That's a great question in terms of numbers. And I should have said, by the way, immediately, especially the independent Black churches, leaders were in the debate on colonization in Africa. Was this good or was it not? And the majority said no. We don't, of African American Christians said no. We don't want colonization. America is where we were born. It's our home. There were a minority that did support it, though, and for different reasons. Some because this place is just too racist. And there were literally white people that were saying that already in the 1700s who supported colonization, partly because, they were swept up in their society, but partly because, like, look, it will never be good here. But others argued, yes, we should. And in fact, Richard Allen and another person that competed with him to be the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the other guy, Coker, was for colonization, but primarily for him, it was like so that we can thrive, but also because he thought we're in a special place to win Africans to Christianity. So just be aware, even on the ground, the debate is real among Black Christians and white Christians. White Christians starting it and having a lot of racist views about it, for it. Black Christians coming in and being primarily against it, and those who are for it for very different reasons, for self-protection and to win Africa to Christ.
Well, I guess we should stop. You're just fascinating.
It's been fun. Thank you.
Really fascinating. We so much appreciate having you, and I'm sure that everyone's looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Gorman.